Welcome to part 3 of WTF was the Vietnam War. Now, if you're just tuning in, I recommend that you watch parts 1 and 2 so that you're totally up to speed, or not, it's totally up to you. But when we left off, the US was frantic over this domino theory, and they started ramping up troops in South Vietnam. Remember, it was the South versus the North, and the Americans were in the South. So now, I'm going to tell you something that is going to blow your mind. So the last time the US actually declared war was World War II. Yeah, you heard right. Congress has not authorized a single war since then. But what about Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, and obviously Vietnam? Nope. If you don't believe me, Google it. How is this possible, you might ask? Well, with each administration, the executive branch finds new and, let's say, creative ways to sugarcoat the situation by calling it things like sending in humanitarian aid, or advisors, or drones, rather than just calling it what it oftentimes is, war. Because war would require getting Congress involved, and who wants to do that? The catalyst for this norm was a little known but widely consequential event that we're going to talk about today, because it happened during the Vietnam War, and it's known as the Gulf of Tonking Incident. So it was 1964, and President Lyndon B. Johnson was the third president now to inherit a crisis in Vietnam that was getting worse by the day. He was under enormous public pressure to end this war that he never started. And by all accounts, at least everything I've read, LBJ really wanted to focus on building his great society. He had a huge domestic agenda that included things like, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that pesky situation in Vietnam was just consuming him. Remember, at this point, US involvement was limited to just a few military advisors, and the White House had that military on a very, very tight leash for fear of adding China to their growing list of problems. But the Defense Department argued, and LBJ agreed, that they'd been half-assing it in Vietnam since the 50s. If they ever wanted to see an end to this war, they had to commit. Just get in and get it over with. The problem was that LBJ needed a legitimate reason to go around Congress and send in more troops. Remember, the Constitution states that only Congress has the power to declare war. The loud and growing public opposition to this war, though, meant that getting Congress on board would be a hard no. He needed an emergency to unlock his full powers as commander-in-chief, and the Gulf of Tonking Incident provided it. This event that you've probably never heard of was one of the most significant turning points in the entire war. So, what happened? Well, to make a long story short, the US military had gathered intelligence that North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is in North Vietnam, had engaged in an unprovoked attack on 2 US Navy destroyers. This was serious. If it was true, it would be considered an act of war and definitely grounds for retaliatory action. But the intelligence was shoddy at best, and years later, it was actually proven to be entirely false. Nonetheless, Johnson jumped on the opportunity, and before any of the reports had even been verified, he interrupted regular programming. Remember, in those days, there were like 3 TV channels, to report the attack to the public on live TV and request the authority from Congress to respond with force in self-defense. Now, Congress, no less immune to the Red Scare that crippled the nation, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution 3 days later. Can you imagine Congress doing something in 3 days today? And this essentially gave Johnson carte blanche to take all the necessary steps to protect the country against the attack that never happened. This resolution is what led to the first major escalation of troops in Vietnam, and it became the legal justification for the open warfare that would continue on for the next decade. Now look, I want to be fair, and hindsight is 20/20, and it's impossible to put ourselves in the shoes of the decision makers at that time. See, the tragedy of leadership is that everyone knows when you screw up, right? But you rarely get credit for your achievements because oftentimes those achievements are in preventing something that never actually happened. Maybe if we sat back and did nothing, the domino theory would have actually turned out to be true. We'll never know. But in the case of escalation in Vietnam, there were a few objecting senators whose predictions turned out to be spot on. And one that always stood out to me is by Senator Morse from Oregon, who said, quote, "I believe this resolution to be a historic mistake. I believe that within the next century, future generations will look with dismay and great disappointment upon a Congress which is now about to make such a historic mistake. By now, we all know about the many tragedies of Vietnam, but less discussed are the norms and the precedents that were established during those crucial years that perpetuated a vicious cycle of escalation and increased presidential authority that we're still grappling with today. So I'm gonna let you sit with that for a bit. And we'll be back with part 4. I don't know what part of the war we're gonna talk about yet, but I'll figure it out and I'll be back to discuss more on Vietnam.